Hello everybody, I am Ben from Team Panic, and as you can see, I am not at home right now. I'm actually out in Colorado, getting myself set up and prepared for AVC. And as that's the case, we're not actually doing any AVC stuff in this video. We're going to be looking at how, well, at least how I learned to drive, or at least how I try to drive weird and interesting robots. And to do that, we're going to have a look at Disquise, my Will-It bot 150 gram ant weight robot that I built a little while ago that uses a very weird system to clamp down on its opponents. Also, because it's so heavy, because it's made out of a mask that weighs a lot of grams, it doesn't have very good traction on its wheels, which means that it can't just kind of clamp and push, and normally if it clamps something, it itself gets pushed around. So we're going to have a look at some of the footage from that, and I'm going to break down some of the steps that have happened as I've gone through and tried to learn how to actually drive this thing, because it's a very weird, interesting shape. It's not as easy as learning to drive something like a spinner, which you basically build a box that you can test in, spin the spinner up, and just drive lots and lots and lots. Because your whole point with the spinner is to try and get that spinner into your opponent, and you need to know how the robot's going to behave with the weapon running to be able to do that. With something like Disguise, though, the weapon itself is a whole clamping mechanism, and its effectiveness is determined by your opponents and by having your opponents in the arena. So you can't just throw Disguise in the arena and run it around a little bit and hope that you're going to know how it's going to fight, because there's nothing in the arena for you to clamp, and if you can clamp something, it's not going to push you around like an opponent does. So you need, for these weird and interesting robots, you really need fight time. And that's what I've had now. I've had a lot of fight time with Disguise. So we're going to look at some old footage of Disguise, and I'm going to have a quick chat about how I used to drive the robot, and then we're going to look at some fight footage from the August ARC meet, and I'll show you the little weird quirk that I found that actually makes driving this thing a lot easier. Alright, let's get started. So going all the way back to Disguise's first fights, I started out basically using the robot the way I designed to use the robot. So I was attempting to have the grabbing section raised the entire time the fight was going, unless I clamped down on somebody and then I was, pushing them around. And as you can see here, I found out very quickly that this system just was not working for me. When the robot was raised up like that, I was finding that I couldn't actually drive very well. Sure, the wheels were on the ground, but so was the stabilizing bar, and what it meant was I couldn't drive very well at all. In fact, sometimes I could barely get off the line if I had the clamp pulled up, because what it was seeming to do was rest on the arm and then on the stabilizing bar and not be resting properly on the wheel. So I was just in a bit of a state, and that meant that by the time we moved over to Hybrid World, I was doing something different. So by the time Hybrid World rolled around, I had learnt my lesson, or at least started to learn my lesson, and was only raising the grabbing arm when I was close enough to my opponents for it to make any difference. This served two purposes. A, it actually made me, allowed me to drive to my opponent, unlike in the first couple of fights. It also meant that I spent less time vulnerable, because of course, Disguise being a big unwieldy bot as it is, if it gets tipped over sideways, it actually gets counted out, because it can't self-right once it ends up on its back. And the only way for it to end up on its back is when I'm up with the grabbing claw open, and then I get thrown over sideways. So the more time I spend with the grabbing claw open, the more vulnerable I am. So in this fight, I'm spending a lot of time with the grabbing arm down, and then only opening it when I get close to my opponent, and just trying my very best to not get shoved around or get shoved sideways and end up on my back. The thing here is, a lot of these grabs here that you see, I also am grabbing them pretty much from the front. Like, I am charging straight at them, grabbing them from the front, and that's a big issue because the traction in Disguise is terrible, which means I'm getting pushed around all over the place, as you're seeing in this fight here, which really didn't help me very much in this tournament. I mean, I still came out relatively well out of Hybrid World, but still, it wasn't a great showing for Disguise. Disguise can do better than what we did at Hybrid World. So now let's take a quick look at some of the fights from August and see what I mean. So here we go. This is an yet unseen fight from August, and this is actually the fight that got me excited to do this video, because in this fight I took some of the things that I learned from both the June meet and Hybrid World. As you can see, I'm clamping only when I get near, and I'm trying to clamp from the sides, and then I do this. So what happened there is, while they were underneath me, I jammed them into the wall, and then they kind of got up a little bit, and the hook that pushes Disguise's mask up hooked onto them and threw them backwards. And just to prove that it wasn't a fluke, I did it twice there, and that second time was actually me just making sure to myself that yes, that was actually what I had just done. So this was kind of a bit of a freak accident, but it has taught me a lot about the robot. And the way we got here is basically by incrementally learning how to drive the robot. So as I said, right at the start, I thought that the best way to drive the robot was going to be up with the grabbing claw open at all times, and I learnt very quickly that that wasn't the way to do things. Then I learnt that grabbing people by the front wasn't the best way of going about things either, and then I realized that if I could grab somebody and push them into the wall, the claw inside Disguise is actually going to help me here and throw them over backwards, which means I can get people upside down. Now, in a lot of the ant weights that I'm fighting, upside down isn't a huge deal because a lot of them are self-righting or do have a lifting arm that they can use to kind of fix that for themselves. But even in the ones that can drive upside down, driving upside down is a big pain, which means that my opponent is at a disadvantage when they're attempting to drive upside down because they're trying to drive backwards, essentially. So having this knowledge, being able to push somebody into the wall and flip them over is a really helpful skill to have. Of course, it doesn't quite work with everybody, but we'll have a look at that now. And this is that type of robot that this strategy does not work on. Low, flat, wide robots just are really hard to get pushed up against the wall like that, and if I can, the grabbing arm is less effective at actually being able to grab them and throw them backwards because they're a wider, flatter robot, which makes it hard to get a good grip on them and, do all of the things that I want to do. However, the same principles that got us to finding this trick still apply. So it's a case of trying to leave the grabbing arm down as much as possible, although I do break that rule here, and trying to grab from the side so that I'm not getting bullied around as much as I am when I'm grabbing from the front or the back. You see here, I've got him from the side and there's not much you can do about it, and I'm still able to push him around a little bit. At least when the grabber is down, because when the grabber is down, I tend to jam up wheels and things a little bit more. If the grabber is not, then I tend to be pushed around a fair bit. Also, at this point, the grabbing arm actually broke off Disguise. It's literally, the grabbing arm is a 3D printed piece that gets duct taped to a servo horn, so it's not all that strong a connection, and when I lose it, it means that there's nothing much I can do. So in this fight, it's basically all over for Disguise right now because, I can't raise up and raise back down again. I thought my opponent was out, but he was just waiting for the pit to drop so that he didn't get in the pit himself. And yeah, without a grabbing arm, as you can see, all I'm able to do is ramp up and over his wedge. I do try and push him around a little bit, but as I mentioned, the wheels that I'm running don't have the greatest traction on them, so I'm kind of in a bad spot. I am trying to get him in the pit, and I was pretty close there for a second, but unfortunately not close enough because he managed to get away from me while I was doing that. And then, he basically got the advantage, and he's now able to get in underneath me, start pushing me around a little bit. Tried to get me in that pit. Thankfully, my wheels were up over by him, so I was still able to keep driving. And I do have a little bit of traction, but then here I end up in the pit. And of course, I should be able to get myself out of the pit from this position, but the grabbing arm is gone, so I am stuck, which means that I lose that fight. But on the whole, I've learned a lot about driving Disguise, and as long as the arm for the grabbing weapon actually stays on, I usually do pretty well. So there you go, that is kind of how I learned to drive Disguise. I went in with a plan, I went in with an idea, I tried it out, it didn't work, and I just kept trying different things over and over again, and I just learnt slowly and incrementally as I fought Disguise. As I said, it was just about having the time in the arena, having opponents that I could face constantly that was able to give me this time that I needed to learn the skills that I have now to drive the weird robot that is Disguise. And without that time in the arena, I would never have been able to drive Disguise as well as I do today, because I wouldn't understand how the robot fares against an opponent. As I said at the start of the video, with things like spinning weapons, it's a very different matter, because as long as you can spin the weapon up and drive at the same time, somewhere safe, you will learn a lot about how your robot behaves and how it's controlled. But when you have a controlling weapon or a grabbing weapon, similar to Disguise, then you actually end up having to have an opponent there. Because a spinning weapon, you're going to spin the weapon up, move around, hit your opponent, and you're both going to go flying. That's just the way that's going to work, especially if you've got enough energy in your spinning weapon. With a grabbing and controlling weapon, when you grab hold of your opponent, the actions that they perform are going to dictate how effective you are. And so you're going to have to change the way you grab and control opponents based on how opponents behave when you try and grab and control them. So with Disguise, as I said, I tried out the way I thought it was going to work. That didn't work very well, so I just slowly changed little bits and pieces, and as things worked or didn't work, I've adopted them or discarded them from my driving style completely. Yeah, so anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Next week I should have an AVC prep video. It might even be a little bit of a collab. It depends on how much time I have while I'm here to edit and do bits and pieces. But there will be a video up next week, so I will see you then.